He expected a black-edged letter within a year. He expected the damp, the rot, and the profound isolation of Blackwood Manor to do the work he was too much of a gentleman, and too much of a coward, to do himself. He expected the problem of Miss Illara Vance to resolve itself into a quiet, country grave, a footnote in the history of his ducal responsibilities. He did not expect to return, broken and hollowed out by war and politics, to find the tomb he had sent her to had become a fortress. He did not expect the ghost he had made of her to be standing in the doorway, very much alive, with dirt on her hands and fire in her eyes, the undisputed queen of a kingdom he had abandoned. And he certainly did not expect that the only home he had left in the world was the one she had built from the ashes of his neglect. The solicitor's office was a study in beige. Beige walls, beige files tied with beige ribbon, and a beige man with a voice like dust settling on old paper. Alastair, the Duke of Wrexham, stood by the window, his back to the room, watching a fat drop of London rain trace a path down the grimy pane. He was not interested in the beige man, nor in the document he was preparing. He was interested in the finality of it, the clean surgical cut that would sever this last, tedious obligation. An obligation born of a foolish battlefield promise made to a dying man. He had promised to care for the man's daughter. He had not promised how. Behind him, Illara Vance sat perfectly still. She had been placed in her chair by her aunt, a woman whose desperation was a palpable, cloying scent in the small room, more potent than the mildew in wet wool. Illara herself smelled of nothing at all. She seemed to be made of paper and shadow, a pale sketch of a girl with eyes far too large and lucid for her narrow face. A persistent, dry little cough was the only sign she was a creature of substance. It was the cough that had sealed her fate. No suitor of quality would take a chance on a dowerless orphan with the sound of the churchyard in her lungs. She was a bad investment. Alastair knew this because he had, for a brief, mad period, been her fiancé. The terms of her father's will, and his own misplaced sense of honor, had bound them together in a betrothal that had lasted precisely as long as it took for his solicitors to find a loophole. The loophole was Blackwood Manor, an estate so remote, so dilapidated, it was technically uninhabitable and thus held no real value. By bestowing it upon her, along with a minuscule annuity that would barely cover the cost of firewood, he was not disowning her. He was providing for her. The law, in its infinite and majestic absurdity, would agree. "The deed is prepared, Your Grace," the beige solicitor murmured, his pen scratching across the parchment. "Miss Vance will have title to Blackwood Manor and its lands, in perpetuity, along with the appointed annuity, effective immediately." Alastair did not turn. He watched the raindrop reach the bottom of the sash and merge with the damp wood. Excellent. The word was a stone dropped into a deep well. If Miss Vance would be so good as to sign, the solicitor prompted gently. There was a rustle of bombazine as her aunt leaned in, whispering urgently. Illara did not seem to hear. Her gaze was fixed on the Duke's broad back, the immaculate tailoring of his dark coat stretched across shoulders that carried the weight of ministries and the fate of nations. He had not looked at her once since entering the room. He had addressed all his remarks to the solicitor or the window pane. It was a masterclass in dismissal. She was not a person to be dealt with, but a line item to be crossed off a ledger. She coughed, a small, rattling sound. Her aunt flinched. Alastair's shoulders went rigid. For a moment, the silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ticking of a clock that seemed to be counting down the seconds of her life. Then she rose. The movement was slow, deliberate. She walked to the desk, her worn boots making no sound on the floorboards. She picked up the pen. Her hand was steady. Her eyes, when she finally lifted them from the document to the solicitor's face, were not the eyes of a consumptive waif. They were clear, cold, and assessing. "Perpetuity," she said, her voice surprisingly low and clear, without a trace of a tremor or a cough. "That is a very long time." The solicitor blinked. "Indeed, miss." "And the annuity," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "It is to be paid quarterly, as stipulated, Miss Vance." And if the Duke predeceases me, a sharp intake of breath from her aunt. The solicitor's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Even Alistair shifted his weight, the faintest ripple of surprise. He had expected tears, pleading, a grateful prostration for the crumbs he was offering. He had not expected a negotiation. The solicitor cleared his throat. The annuity is tied to the estate of the Duke of Wrexham, not his person. It would, of course, continue. I see. She dipped the pen in the inkwell. Her signature was not the feathery, uncertain scrawl of a gentlewoman. It was stark, angular, and defiantly legible. Alara Vance. She slid the document back across the desk. Then, and only then, did she turn to face the Duke. The room was small, but the distance between them felt like miles of frozen tundra. He finally turned from the window, his face a mask of aristocratic indifference. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they passed over her as if she were a piece of furniture he had forgotten was in the room. "You have what you wanted, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was not accusatory. It was a statement of fact, as devoid of emotion as his own. "Your freedom from a tiresome burden. I have fulfilled my promise to your father," he corrected, his tone clipped. "You are provided for." "I am buried," she countered, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, a smile that did not reach her eyes. "But you have been kind enough to provide me with my own mausoleum. For that, I suppose I should be grateful." For the first time, a flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, or grudging respect, crossed his features. He had expected a dying ember, and found instead a spark of flint. "The carriage is waiting," he said, pulling on his gloves. "It will take you to Blackwood." "And you, Your Grace? Where will you go?" "To my duty," he said, the words a shield and a dismissal. He was already moving toward the door, his mind on treaties and political appointments, on the real, important world he inhabited. "Of course," she murmured to his retreating back. "Duty is such a convenient excuse for cruelty." He paused at the door, his hand on the brass knob. He did not turn around. He did not say goodbye. He simply opened the door and walked out, leaving her alone in the beige room with the smell of wet wool, the ticking of the clock, and the deed to her own tomb. Alara stood for a long moment, listening to his footsteps fade down the hall. She did not cough. She did not cry. She simply looked down at her ink-stained fingers and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the faintest, most dangerous flicker of something that was not despair. It was resolve. The journey north was a descent. The manicured green of the home counties gave way to rolling hills, then to stark, windswept moors. The roads deteriorated from smooth gravel to rutted tracks of mud and stone. The rain that had been a gentle London drizzle became a relentless, driving assault, turning the world outside the carriage window into a gray, weeping blur. Alara sat alone, bundled in a threadbare traveling cloak, her aunt having tearfully departed after the signing. The ducal carriage was well sprung, but it could not entirely smooth the jolts that jarred her bones, nor could its plush interior banish the insidious, creeping damp that seemed to seep through the very leather of the seats. For 3 days, she traveled in near total silence, speaking only to the stoic coachman when they stopped at grim, unwelcoming inns. She ate what was put before her, stale bread, thin soup, and slept in cold, musty beds, the sound of the rain a constant companion. She was a parcel being delivered to a forgotten address. She felt less like a person and more like an object, a piece of unwanted luggage being transported to its final destination. The Duke had not accompanied her. Of course he had not. He had dispatched her with the same impersonal efficiency with which he might dispatch a letter. He had provided the carriage, the coachman, and the route. His involvement was complete. On the 4th day, the landscape changed again. The moors fell away, replaced by a dense, tangled forest of ancient oaks and yews, their branches clawed and grasping, heavy with moss that dripped water like a weeping wound. The air grew colder, thick with the smell of decay and wet earth. The coachman, a man whose face seemed carved from granite, finally spoke without being prompted. "Blackwood lands, miss," he grunted, his voice a low rumble. Alara peered out the window. There was no discernible difference, no grand gate or marker. The only sign was that the road, if it could be called that, had become even worse. Low-hanging branches scraped against the roof of the carriage, a sound like fingernails on a coffin lid. The wheels sank into deep, sucking mud, and the horses strained, their breath pluming in the frigid air. It was a land that did not want to be entered. An hour later, they broke through the trees, and she saw it. Blackwood Manor was not a house. It was a skeleton. It crouched on a low hill, a sprawling mass of gray stone slick with rain and green with lichen. Half the roof had collapsed, leaving the jagged ribs of its rafters exposed to the sky. Windows gaped like empty eye sockets, many of them boarded over, others simply shattered. The gardens that must have once surrounded it were now a riot of weeds and thorns, a tangled, choking mess that swarmed the very foundations of the house, trying to drag it back into the earth. It was not a rotting tooth, as she had imagined. It was a whole jawbone, picked clean by time and neglect, left to bleach in the perpetual twilight of the north. The carriage lurched to a halt on a patch of gravel that was more mud than stone. The coachman climbed down, his boots making a squelching sound. He opened her door, and a blast of cold, damp air filled the carriage, carrying the scent of cold ash and mildew. "We're here, miss." Alara gathered her small, pathetic bundle of belongings and stepped out. The mud immediately tried to claim her worn boots. She stood, a small, solitary figure in the vast, oppressive landscape of her new life, and stared up at the monstrous ruin that was now her home, her prison, her grave. The great oak door, studded with rusted iron, remained stubbornly closed. There was no sign of welcome, no light in the windows, no smoke from a few intact chimneys. It was a house that was holding its breath, waiting. After a moment, the coachman pounded on the door. The sound echoed, flat and dead. He pounded again, harder. From deep within the house, there was a scraping sound, the protest of a heavy bolt being drawn. The door creaked open a few inches, revealing a sliver of profound darkness and the severe, unsmiling face of a woman in a starched black dress. "What do you want?" The voice was as welcoming as a gravestone. "Delivery for the house," the coachman said, his tone devoid of deference. "Miss Vance." The woman's eyes, small and sharp, flickered over Alara, taking in the cheap cloak, the pale face, the sheer insignificance of her. It was a look of profound, dismissive contempt. The Duke said nothing of a visitor. "She's not a visitor," the coachman grunted, already turning back to his horses. He had orders, it seemed, and they did not include pleasantries. "She's the new mistress." He began unstrapping her single, small trunk from the back of the carriage. The woman in the doorway, who could only be the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, let out a sound that was half scoff, half snort. "Mistress?" she repeated, the word sour in her mouth. "Mistress of this." She gestured vaguely at the ruin behind her. The coachman dropped the trunk in the mud with a wet thud. "My orders are complete." The Duke said to leave her. Saw him leaving her, and that was it. He climbed back on his box, not even giving Alara a backward glance. He did not need to. He was a servant of the Duke, and the Duke had made his intentions perfectly clear. "Be quietly. Do not be a bother." With a crack of his whip and a spray of muddy water, the carriage lurched away, its wheels churning the drive into a deeper morass. Alara did not move. She simply stood, the rain plastering her hair to her scalp, and watched it disappear back into the dripping, grasping woods. The sound of its passage faded, replaced by the sighing of the wind through the broken roof and the steady, relentless drumming of the rain. She was alone, utterly, completely alone, left in the mud at the foot of a dying house, with a hostile housekeeper and the weight of a future that felt as cold and as final as the stone at her feet. "Well," Mrs. Gable's voice cut through her reverie, sharp as a shard of glass. "Are you going to stand there and drown, or are you coming in?" Without waiting for an answer, the housekeeper turned and disappeared into the gloom of the house, leaving the door agape. It was not an invitation. It was a challenge. Alara looked from the gaping black maw of the doorway to the single trunk sitting in the mud. She took a deep breath. The air was cold, heavy, and tasted of despair. She walked to the trunk, bent down, and with a strength she did not know she possessed, hauled it out of the muck and began to drag it, step by painful step, toward the house. She would not leave it behind. It was hers, and in this desolate place, she would cling to everything that was hers with the ferocity of a starving wolf. The great hall of Blackwood Manor was attuned for light. What little sun managed to pierce the weeping gray sky was swallowed whole by the cavernous space. Dust motes, thick as insects, swarmed in the few pathetic shafts that penetrated the grimy, high-arched windows. The air was a physical presence, a thick, cloying blanket woven from the scents of damp stone, cold ash from a fireplace that had not seen a flame in a generation, and the pervasive, sweetish smell of decay. A grand staircase, its balustrade thick with cobwebs, swept upwards into darkness. Furniture huddled under ghostly white dust cloths, their shapes monstrous and unrecognizable in the gloom. It was a place where memories had come to die. Mrs. Gable led her not to one of the grand, shrouded rooms, but up a narrow, winding servant stair at the back of the house, the stone steps worn into deep troughs by centuries of hurried feet. The air grew colder, the damp more profound. They passed corridor after corridor of closed doors, each one a sealed crypt. Finally, the housekeeper pushed open a door at the very end of a long, drafty passage. "This will be your room," she announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. The room was small, mean, and brutally cold. It was an attic room, tucked under the eaves, with a sloping ceiling that wept beads of moisture. A narrow bed with a thin, lumpy mattress was pushed against one wall. A rickety washstand holding a cracked basin and a small, scarred chest of drawers were the only other furniture. A single, small window, its glass filmed with grime, looked out not onto the front of the house, but onto the slate expanse of the crumbling roof and the endless, weeping sky. It was a room designed for a person of no importance. A room designed for someone who was not expected to last the winter. "The Duke sent word we were to make you comfortable," Mrs. Gable said, the word comfortable laced with a thick, obvious irony. "Dinner is at 6. If there is any—" She turned to leave. "Wait." Alara's voice was a croak. The journey, the cold, the sheer oppressive weight of the house were settling into her bones, into her lungs. The familiar tickle was starting at the back of her throat. Mrs. Gable paused, her hand on the doorframe, her expression one of weary impatience. "A fire," Alara managed. "Please, could I have a fire?" The housekeeper's gaze flickered to the small, bricked-up fireplace in the corner of the room. "Chimney's blocked. Has been for 20 years. Like most everything else in this house," she gestured around the bleak room. "This wing is closed. No staff, no fires. It's not safe. The Duke's orders." "But the Duke sent me here," Alara said, a thread of desperation weaving into her voice. "Indeed he did," Mrs. Gable said, and the look she gave Alara was one of grim, almost pitying understanding. It was the look one gave to a lamb being led to slaughter. "He sent you to the closed wing. You might want to think on what that means, miss." And with that, she was gone, her footsteps echoing down the hall, leaving Alara alone in the cold, damp, and profound silence of her designated grave. The next few days blurred into a miserable, feverish haze. The cold of the room was a living thing, a predator that sank its teeth into her and refused to let go. She spent most of the time huddled in the lumpy bed, wrapped in her cloak and the single, thin blanket, shivering uncontrollably. The cough that had been a mere nuisance in London became a violent, racking force that tore at her chest and left her breathless and weak. A young, sullen-looking maid would appear twice a day with a tray bearing a bowl of thin gruel and a piece of hard bread, placing it just inside the door before scurrying away, as if Alara's illness were contagious. It probably was. She was dying. The realization came not with a sense of panic or fear, but with a dull, resigned certainty. The Duke had been right. This was the perfect solution. She would fade away quietly, a ghost in a forgotten house, and no one would be bothered. Mrs. Gable would write a neat, respectful letter. The Bay solicitor would file it away, and Alastair, Duke of Wrexham, would be free. He had not murdered her. He had simply created the conditions in which she could not possibly live. It was clean. It was efficient. It was utterly, damnably cruel. She drifted in and out of a fever dream, her thoughts a tangled mess of the solicitor's beige face, the Duke's cold eyes, and the endless, dripping rain. She was so weak she could barely lift her head from the pillow. The gruel on the tray by the door often went untouched. She was losing. The house was winning. The damp was winning. The Duke was winning. On the fourth morning, she woke to a sliver of watery sunlight finding its way through the grime on her window. The rain had stopped. The silence in the house was different, not oppressive, but merely quiet. She lay there, listening to the frantic, panicked beating of her own heart. She felt a strange clarity, a stillness at the center of her fever. She thought of her father, a soldier who had died on a field of mud and blood, his last thoughts on her, his daughter. He had entrusted her to his friend, a man he had believed to be honorable. He had entrusted her to the Duke. A surge of something hot and fierce, something that had been buried under layers of grief and illness and despair, flooded through her. It was anger, white-hot, incandescent anger. She would not die. She would not die in this cold, mean room. She would not die to make Alastair's life more convenient. She would not become a tidy, tragic footnote in his glorious history. He had sentenced her to this place, but she would be damned if she would serve the sentence. The decision was a physical shock, a jolt that propelled her from the bed. Her legs were weak, trembling, but they held her. She stood, swaying, in the middle of the room, the threadbare night dress hanging off her skeletal frame. She looked at her reflection in the grimy window pane, a pale, haunted wraith with wild eyes and matted hair. The dying woman. No, she was not the dying woman anymore. The dying woman had been a victim, a passive creature waiting for her fate. The woman standing in this room, now, was something else entirely. She was a survivor. She grabbed the water pitcher from the washstand. The water was icy cold, but she poured it into the basin and splashed it on her face, gasping at the shock. She scrubbed at the grime on her skin, her movements clumsy but determined. She was alive. She was cold and weak and hungry, but she was alive. Her gaze fell upon the tray of untouched gruel by the door. She walked over, picked up the bowl, and forced herself to eat the cold, tasteless paste, spoonful by spoonful. It was fuel, nothing more. Then she dressed, not in the night dress of an invalid, but in her sturdiest traveling dress, the one made of dark, practical wool. She brushed her hair with her fingers, pulling the tangled mess back and tying it at the nape of her neck. She looked at her reflection again. Still pale, still thin, but the wraith was gone. In its place was a woman with a purpose. She walked to the door and opened it. The long, dark corridor stretched before her. She took a step out of her prison. Her first command was not to be a grand pronouncement. It was a simple, practical necessity. She made her way back down the treacherous servant's stair, her hand trailing along the cold, damp stone wall for support. She found her way to the kitchens, a vast, vaulted, and mostly deserted chamber at the back of the house. A single, enormous hearth held a small, sulking fire, around which huddled two maids and the formidable Mrs. Gable, a cup of tea in her hand. They looked up as she entered, their expressions a mixture of surprise and, in Mrs. Gable's case, frank annoyance. They were not used to being disturbed. Alara stood in the doorway, drawing herself up to her full, unimpressive height. "Mrs. Gable," she said, her voice clear and steady. The housekeeper raised an eyebrow. "Miss Vance, I had thought you were indisposed." The unspoken words hung in the air. "I'd thought you were dying." "I'm moving my things," Alara announced, ignoring the jab. "Out of that room. Out of that wing. It is, as you said, unsafe. And cold." Mrs. Gable took a slow sip of her tea. "And where did you plan on moving them to?" "The house is closed. His Grace's orders." "Is the entire house cold and damp?" Alara countered, her gaze sweeping the kitchen. The fire in the hearth, though small, was real. There was warmth here. Life. This room is warm. This is the kitchen, Mrs. Gable stated, as if speaking to a particularly dense child. We cook here, and you live nearby, I presume? Your rooms are not in the closed wing. A flicker of resentment in the housekeeper's eyes. My rooms are in the east wing, near the pantry. Then I will take a room in the east wing, Alaris said simply. A small one. A servant's room, if necessary. But one with a chimney that draws and a roof that does not leak. I have no authority to open rooms, Mrs. Gable said, her lips thinning into a stubborn line. The Duke is in London, concerning himself with treaties and ministers. Alara cut in, her voice sharp. The Duke is not here, shivering in a room that is actively trying to kill him. I am. The deed to this property has my name on it. It is my house, and I will not die in it to satisfy an order given by a man 1,000 miles away. Now, you will show me to a habitable room, or I will move my bed into this kitchen and sleep by this fire. The choice is yours. The two maids stared, their mouths agape. No one spoke to Mrs. Gable like that. In a tense silence, Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The first battle. If she lost this, she lost everything. Mrs. Gable stared at her, her dark eyes narrowed. She was assessing this strange, skeletal creature who had somehow crawled out of her sickbed to challenge her authority. She saw the fever-bright eyes, the trembling hands, but she also saw the iron spine, the unwavering resolve. This was not the pathetic girl who had arrived in the rain. Slowly, deliberately, Mrs. Gable placed her teacup on the table with a firm click. She rose to her feet. Very well, she said, her voice tight with disapproval. There's a linen closet off the main pantry. It has a window. The roof only leaks when the wind is from the west. It was not a victory. It was a concession, granted with the worst possible grace. But it was enough. That will do perfectly, Alara said, a wave of light-headedness washing over her. Thank you. She had not won a drawing room. She had won a closet. But in the war for Blackwood, it was the first piece of ground she had taken. And as she followed Mrs. Gable's rigid back out of the kitchen, she knew, with absolute certainty, that it would not be the last. The linen closet was exactly as miserable as Mrs. Gable had described it, but with one crucial difference. It was dry. And with the addition of her own mattress and a small grate scavenged from a derelict storeroom, it could be warm. It was from this tiny, cramped command post that Alara began her campaign to reclaim Blackwood Manor. She stopped thinking of it as a house and started thinking of it as a patient, a vast, broken body that she needed to keep alive through a long, hard winter. The first principle of triage, she reasoned, was to stop the bleeding. Her first action, once she had regained a measure of her strength, was to demand the account books. Mrs. Gable resisted, of course, citing ducal privilege and years of tradition. Alara was relentless. She did not shout or make threats. She simply appeared every morning in the housekeeper's stuffy parlor and sat in a hardback chair, waiting. She would wait for hours, silent and patient, her presence a constant, unnerving reproach. After 3 days of this silent siege, Mrs. Gable threw a set of massive, leather-bound ledgers onto the table in front of her. Much good may they do you, the housekeeper had snapped. They're a disaster. She was right. The ledgers were a testament to decades of neglect and mismanagement. Entries were sporadic, numbers were fudged, and entire pages seemed to be missing. But Alara, the dowerless orphan, had been raised by a father who believed a woman's best protection was not a pretty face, but a keen mind. She had a head for figures. She spent weeks in her tiny room, fueled by weak tea and a fierce, cold determination, poring over the chaotic accounts. She cross-referenced bills of lading with household expenses, tenant farm receipts with expenditures for repairs that had clearly never been made. Slowly, a picture emerged. It was a picture of slow-motion theft. Not a grand conspiracy, but 100 tiny leaks. The butcher was overcharging. The chandler was billing for twice the number of candles delivered. A steward, long since retired, had been paying himself a second salary for years. Mrs. Gable, she noted with a grim sort of satisfaction, was meticulously honest in her own accounts, but she was blind, either through incompetence or willful ignorance, to the grift that was happening all around her. Alara started by cutting off the rot. She wrote a series of brutally concise letters. To the butcher in the village, effective immediately, all orders will be weighed upon delivery. Any discrepancies will be deducted from payment. I am certain this will come as a relief to you, as you must have been concerned about the accuracy of your scales to the chandler. Please be advised that Blackwood Manor will henceforth be making its own candles. Thank you for your years of service. Her next move was more audacious. The West Wing, with its collapsed roof and rotting timbers, was a constant drain, a wound that would not heal. It was also filled with generations of ducal treasures, decaying tapestries, silver-gilt furniture riddled with woodworm, entire services of porcelain that had not been used in a century. They were assets sitting in the dark, bleeding value. She found a man in the village, a dour-faced carpenter named Finch, who also served as the estate's groundsman, though what grounds he tended in the surrounding wilderness was a mystery. He was a man of few words and capable hands. She showed him the wing. "A lost cause, miss," he said, prodding a rotten floorboard with his boot. "Best to board it up and forget it." "I don't want to save it," she told him. "I want to salvage it." Under her direction, Finch and a few hired hands from the village went through the West Wing like pragmatic vultures. They stripped the lead from the roof, a valuable commodity. They carefully removed any furniture that could be restored and piled the rest for firewood. And the silver, oh, the silver. Dozens of tarnished, heavy pieces stamped with the ducal crest. Useless, anachronistic, a monument to a grandeur the house could no longer afford. She had Finch load it all onto a cart. The next day, she rode with him, not to the nearest grand city, but to a grimy, bustling port town a day's journey away, a place where no one knew the Wrexham crest, and no one asked questions. She sold it all, by weight, to a man with hard eyes and a melting pot. She did not get its true value, not even close. But she got cash, a small, heavy bag of coins that felt more real and more powerful than all the tarnished silver in the world. When Mrs. Gable found out, she was apoplectic. "The Duke's silver. You sold the Duke's family silver." "The Duke's silver was sitting in a rotting room in a house he has abandoned," Alara replied calmly, counting out coins on the kitchen table. "This money will buy seed for a spring planting. It will pay for glass to repair the conservatory. It will buy 3 milk cows and a dozen chickens. Which do you think the Duke, in his infinite practicality, would prefer?" She was lying, of course. The Duke would be horrified. But the Duke was not here. With the money from the silver and the lead, and the savings from her ruthless accounting, Alara began to consolidate. She and Finch boarded up the entire West Wing and the North Wing as well. They reduced the footprint of the house by 2/3, concentrating their resources on the central block and the East Wing, where the kitchens and servants' quarters were. They repaired the roof over the kitchen. They reglazed the windows in the small conservatory that abutted the dining room. The conservatory became her new obsession. It was a glass-walled room, south-facing, a perfect hothouse. While the grounds outside were still frozen, she and Finch built raised beds inside, filling them with soil from the woods. She spent the last of her silver money on seeds, not for flowers but for herbs and lettuces. Rosemary, thyme, parsley, hardy greens that could withstand the cool temperatures. The first green shoots that pushed their way through the dark soil felt like a personal victory, a defiant act of life in a place dedicated to death. The house was still a ruin, but now it was a ruin with a warm, dry core. It was a ruin with a purpose. The staff, what little of it remained, began to change. The sullen maids, seeing that there was now regular food and a warm kitchen, began to lose their resentful edge. They started to refer to her, not as Miss Vance, but as the mistress. It was not said with affection, not yet, but with a grudging respect. She was not a fine lady. She worked. They saw her with dirt under her fingernails from the garden, with ink stains on her fingers from the ledgers, with cobwebs in her hair from exploring a dusty storeroom. She asked no one to do a job she was not willing to do herself. Even Mrs. Gable began to thaw, a glacial process that was almost imperceptible. She still complained. It was her nature, but her complaints became less about Alara's audacity and more about practical matters. The new chimney in the kitchen smokes if the wind is wrong. Mistress will be out of flour by months, and she had, without realizing it, started to see Alara not as an interloper, but as an ally in the war against entropy. The most significant shift came from Finch. The quiet groundsman became her unofficial lieutenant. He understood her pragmatism. He saw the logic in her decisions. He began to come to her with suggestions, not problems. There's good clay down by the river, mistress. We can make our own bricks for the ovens. Old Man Hemlock's farm is fallow. The lease is up. If we were to take it back, the pasture is good. Could run the cows there. They were a team, a strange, unlikely triumvirate. The pragmatic survivor, the dour housekeeper, and the salt-of-the-earth groundsman. Together, they were holding the line. As the first winter gave way to a cool, damp spring, the house was still a shadow of its former self. But it was a living shadow. There was smoke curling from the kitchen chimney every morning. The scent of baking bread, a smell Blackwood had not known in decades, now filled the east wing. The new cows were in the pasture, and chickens scratched in a pen Finch had built behind the kitchen. In the conservatory, rows of vibrant green seedlings promised a summer harvest. Alara stood on the front steps one evening, watching the sunset paint the weeping sky in shades of bruised purple and faint rose. The house behind her was quiet. It was no longer the monstrous, breathing tomb she had first encountered. It was smaller, leaner, but it was functional. It was hers. She had faced the beast, and, if she had not tamed it, she had at least reached an understanding with it. She had survived. More than that, she was beginning to build. She was no longer the pale sketch of a girl from the solicitor's office. That girl was gone, buried somewhere in the cold attic room of the West Wing. The woman who stood on the steps of Blackwood Manor was the mistress. Her hands were calloused, her face was weathered by the wind, and her eyes held the quiet, steady confidence of someone who knew, with absolute certainty, how to survive. She had built a life, a small, defiant kingdom, from the ruins of the Duke's contempt. And she had done it all without him. She rarely thought of him now. He was a ghost from another life, a cold, distant figure who had, inadvertently, given her the one thing she had never had before, a home. A broken, scarred, and utterly magnificent home. Alastair, Duke of Wrexham, rode alone. For 3 years, he had been at the heart of the machine, a cog in the great grinding engine of government and war. He had negotiated treaties that were broken before the ink was dry. He had sent men to their death for a cause he no longer believed in, and he had attended glittering balls where the champagne flowed like water while the country starved. He had done his duty. He had played the game, and he had lost. The fall was not dramatic. It was a quiet, inexorable slide. A failed campaign on the continent that he had championed. A political alliance that had shattered under the weight of its own corruption. He had become a liability. The king, in his infinite mercy, had not sent him to the Tower. He had simply suggested that the Duke might benefit from a prolonged visit to his country estates. It was a dismissal, wrapped in the silken glove of royal concern. He was being put out to pasture. He had sold his London house. He had no desire to retreat to Wrexham Court, his primary seat, a place filled with memories of his father and the crushing weight of expectation. He needed somewhere else, somewhere quiet, somewhere final, a place to be forgotten. And so, he rode north. He did not think of it as riding to Blackwood Manor. He thought of it as riding to the grave. His mind, hollowed out and exhausted, kept returning to the pale, defiant girl he had sent there. He had received the solicitor's reports, of course. The annuity was being drawn. There had been no black-edged letter. He had assumed she was simply clinging to life, a stubborn weed in a cracked pavement. He pictured a grim, silent house, the last inhabitant a ghostly woman wasting away in a dusty room. The thought, which should have been satisfying in its neatness, now filled him with a vague, unfamiliar sense of unease. He was not going there to see her. He was going there because it was the most desolate, God-forsaken place he owned. It suited his mood. The journey was a mirror of the one Alara had taken, but in reverse. He was leaving the world of power and light and descending into shadow. As he entered the Blackwood lands, the familiar sense of oppression settled on him. The grasping trees, the sucking mud, the perpetual damp. This was right. This was fitting. A tomb for a man whose life was, for all intents and purposes, over. He expected to see the skeleton, the ruin he remembered. The first sign that something was wrong, or rather, not as he expected, was the gate. The old, rusted iron gate had been half off its hinges, choked with ivy. Now it stood straight and true, the rust treated, the hinges oiled. It was closed but not locked. A simple, practical wooden bar held it shut. He dismounted, his boots sinking into mud that was noticeably less deep than he remembered. The road beyond the gate was not paved, but it had been filled with gravel, the worst of the ruts smoothed over. He led his horse through, his brows furrowed in confusion. As he rounded the final bend in the drive, he pulled his horse to a dead stop. He stared. The skeleton was gone. The house was still there, of course, but it was amputated. The entire west wing, the one with the collapsed roof, was gone. Not just boarded up, but dismantled. The stone had been used to build a high, solid wall that sealed off the ruin, creating a neat, if abrupt, end to the building. The north wing was similarly sealed, its windows dark and shuttered. The central block of the house, however, was transformed. The roof had been patched with new slate, dark against the old gray. The windows were glazed, not boarded, and they gleamed, clean and reflective in the watery afternoon light. A thin but steady plume of smoke rose from the main kitchen chimney. In the gardens, the tangled mess of weeds was gone. In its place, stretching from the new wall to the edge of the woods, were neat, orderly rows of vegetables. A vast kitchen garden, a small orchard of young fruit trees, stood protected by a newly built stone wall. A paddock near the woods held 3 placid-looking cows. It was not a grand ducal seat. It was a farm, a prosperous, well-managed, working farm. Alistair felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he had taken a wrong turn and ended up in a different country altogether. He had come here seeking a tomb, a reflection of his own inner ruin. He had found a place that was vibrantly, stubbornly alive. He urged his horse forward, his mind struggling to process the cognitive dissonance. He rounded the corner to the front of the house. The great oak door was no longer forbidding. It was clean, the wood oiled against the weather. The rusted iron had been polished. A row of terracotta pots, overflowing with hardy green herbs, stood on the steps. And that is where he found her. She was not standing in the doorway, waiting. She was on her knees in a flower bed by the steps, a trowel in her hand, her back to him. She wore a plain, dark dress, the skirt hitched up and tucked in her waistband, revealing sturdy, mud-splattered boots. A simple braid of dark hair was escaping from a practical linen cap. There was dirt on her cheek and a smudge of it on her nose. She was humming, a quiet, tuneless sound of pure contentment. He sat on his horse, utterly still, watching her. This was not the pale, consumptive wraith he had banished. This woman was solid, grounded. The slender frame had filled out, not with the soft plumpness of a lady of leisure, but with the lean, wiry strength of someone who worked. She moved with an economy and a purpose that was both alien and strangely compelling. He cleared his throat. It was a small sound, but in the quiet air, it was as loud as a cannon shot. She froze. The humming stopped. For a long moment, she did not move. Then, slowly, deliberately, she placed the trowel on the earth beside her. She wiped her hands on her apron, a futile gesture given the amount of dirt already on them. She rose to her feet, not quickly, but with a smooth, unhurried grace. And then she turned. Her eyes found him instantly. They were the same eyes, the same lucid, intelligent gray. But they were different. The fear was gone. The desperation was gone. They were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of a ruler, surveying an unexpected intrusion into her domain. The smudge of dirt on her nose only served to highlight the aristocratic line of her cheekbones. She was not beautiful in the conventional drawing room sense. She was magnificent. Alistair felt his own carefully constructed facade of weary indifference begin to crack. He had come here expecting to be the master, surveying his forgotten property. But the look in her eyes made it clear who the intruder was. He dismounted, the reins loose in his hand. He felt clumsy, overdressed, absurdly out of place in his fine, travel-stained London clothes. "You're alive," he said. The words came out sounding blunt, accusatory. It was not what he had meant to say at all. A faint, ironic smile touched her lips. It was the same ghost of a smile she had given him in the solicitor's office, but this one reached her eyes, crinkling the corners. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Your Grace," she replied, her voice cool and clear as a winter morning. "I'm sure you will find my continued existence a great disappointment." The power dynamic, which had been his to command for his entire life, had just tilted decisively on its axis. He was the Duke of Wrexham, a man who had commanded armies and advised kings. And in this small, forgotten corner of his own kingdom, he was completely and utterly at a disadvantage. He was an intruder, a stranger, and the woman standing before him, with dirt on her face and sovereignty in her eyes, was the Queen. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken things. 3 years of struggle, a world of change, and a vast, unbridgeable chasm between the man who had left and the man who had returned. Alara did not break it. She simply stood, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, and waited. It was his move. He had appeared on her doorstep. He would have to state his purpose. Alistair felt a muscle jump in his jaw. He was used to controlling every room he entered. Here, he felt like a raw youth being inspected by a formidable headmistress. He gestured vaguely at the transformed landscape, the neat garden rows, the solid wall where a ruin should have been. "What have you done?" he asked, the words sounding lame even to his own ears. "I survived," she said simply. "You made it clear that was not the expected outcome, but I have always been contrary." She bent down, picked up her trowel, and stuck it firmly into the soil of a nearby pot. The gesture was one of finality, of a task completed. "Now, you are tired, your horse is lathered, and is about to rain. I assume you intend to stay." It was not an invitation. It was a practical assessment of the situation. He was here. Night was falling. The nearest inn was a day's ride away. "For a time," he said, his voice stiff. "Of course," she said, her tone dry. "Your duty is done, and you have come to the country for a rest." She saw the flicker in his eyes, the confirmation of her guess, and a small, hard smile touched her lips. How very predictable. Before he could formulate a reply, a man appeared from around the side of the house. It was Finch, his face weathered, his hands gnarled, but his back straight. He stopped when he saw Alistair, his eyes narrowing. He did not look at the Duke with the deference of a servant. He looked at him as a farmer might look at a fox approaching the henhouse. His gaze went from Alistair to Alara, a silent question. "Finch," Alara said, her voice calm and authoritative. "His Grace the Duke of Wrexham has returned to us. He will be staying. See to his horse. Put him in the green room." Finch grunted, a sound of acknowledgement, not subservience. He walked over and took the reins from Alistair's hand without a word, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He was not taking an order from a duke. He was taking an order from his mistress. The subtle shift in loyalty was as profound and as shocking to Alistair as the transformation of the house itself. He was the master here. He owned every stone, every blade of grass. And yet, he had just been rendered irrelevant in his own home. "The green room?" he asked, turning back to Alara. "I seem to recall it overlooks the stables." "It does," she confirmed. "It is also one of only 6 bedrooms in the entire house that currently has a bed, a window, and a floor that is not in immediate danger of collapse. I trust it will be satisfactory." She started walking toward the door, her stride confident. "Mrs. Gable will have a fire lit for you. Dinner is in an hour. We do not dress." She was giving him orders. in his own house. He was so taken aback, so utterly thrown off balance, that he simply followed her like a chastened schoolboy. As he stepped across the threshold, the change was even more striking. The great hall was no longer a tomb. The ghostly dust cloths were gone. The space was still vast and shadowed, but it was clean. The air smelled not of decay, but of beeswax, dried herbs, and wood smoke. A large, rough-hewn table stood in the center of the room, and on it was a chaotic but vibrant collection of items. Baskets of vegetables, piles of ledgers, a stray chicken feather, and a vase filled with wildflowers. This was not a formal hall. It was the bustling heart of a working enterprise. Mrs. Gable appeared from a corridor, her face as severe as ever, but her apron was clean and her step was brisk. She saw Alistair and performed a perfunctory curtsy that was more habit than respect. "Your Grace," she said, her eyes flicking to Alara. "The green room is being prepared." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Alara said. Then she turned to Alistair, her expression all business. "I'll have a bath sent up. Finch has taken your horse. Is there anything else you require before dinner?" She was treating him like a guest, an unexpected, and perhaps slightly inconvenient guest. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it left him speechless. He, who had dismissed her, abandoned her, and sentenced her to death, was now being offered the hospitality of the kingdom she had built in his absence. "No," he finally managed, the word feeling inadequate. "No, that will be all." "Very well." She gave him a small, formal nod, and then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the depths of the house, her house, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the hall, a stranger in a land that should have been his. The world had turned upside down. Or perhaps, he thought with a sudden, dizzying clarity, it had simply, finally, turned right side up. Dinner was a profoundly unsettling experience. It was served not in the grand, drafty dining hall, but in a small, cozy parlor that had once been a morning room. A fire blazed in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering light on the simple, scrub wood table. There were only 3 places set, one for him, one for Alara, and, to his astonishment, one for Finch. The groundsman sat at the table with a quiet, unassuming dignity, his face and hands scrubbed clean, his work clothes exchanged for a simple, tidy shirt. He did not speak unless spoken to, but his presence was a clear and unambiguous statement. Here, in this house, a man's worth was not determined by his title, but by his contribution. Alistair, the Duke, felt his own contribution to be precisely 0. The food was simple but delicious. A thick vegetable stew, fresh bread with a sweet, creamy butter, and cheese that was sharp on the tongue. It was the food of the land, the food he had seen growing in the gardens, the product of the cows in the paddock. It was real. It was honest. It was, in its own way, a rebuke to the elaborate, tasteless meals he had consumed for years in London. Alara sat at the head of the table. She was no longer the mud-stained gardener. She had changed into a clean dress of the same practical dark wool, her hair neatly braided. She was still the mistress, cool, composed, and utterly in control. She directed the conversation, such as it was, with a polite, detached efficiency. She asked him about the state of the roads, the health of the king, the latest news from the continent. She asked these things with the polite, impersonal interest of a monarch inquiring about a foreign land. She was not interested in him, his feelings, or the reasons for his sudden appearance. She was gathering information. He found himself answering her questions with a strange, unaccustomed honesty. The weariness he had kept so carefully hidden in London, the deep, bone-crushing cynicism of a man who has seen the sausage of politics being made, began to seep into his words. "The roads are a disgrace," he said, "but no one in Parliament cares, because they all have carriages with good springs." "And the king?" she prompted. "The king is more interested in the cut of his new coat than the state of his army," he replied, a bitter edge to his voice. Alara listened, her expression unreadable. Finch ate his stew, his gaze fixed on his bowl, but Alistair had the distinct impression that the man was listening to every word. "And the war?" she asked, her voice soft. Alistair put down his spoon. The firelight glinted off the polished wood of the table. The war is a butcher's bill, paid for by boys who have never seen a map, for the benefit of old men who will never hear a shot fired in anger. The words were treasonous. They were the thoughts he had barely dared to admit to himself in the dead of night. And he had just spoken them aloud, to the woman he had tried to destroy and her groundsman. The silence that fell was different this time. It was not tense. It was contemplative. It was Finch who broke it. He looked up from his stew, his gaze meeting Alistair's directly for the first time. "My boy Tom," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He was at Vimero. Never came back." He did not say it with anger or with grief. It was a simple statement of fact, a line in the great, bloody ledger of war. Alistair felt a hot flush of shame. He had been one of the men who had sent Tom to Vimero. He had signed the orders, moved the regiments on the map like chess pieces. "I am sorry," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Finch just nodded and went back to his stew. Alara watched the exchange, her gray eyes missing nothing. She saw the crack in the Duke's armor, the first hint of the broken man beneath the title. After the meal, Finch excused himself with a nod and disappeared. Alistair expected Alara to retire as well, to leave him to his wine, as was the custom. Instead, she rose from the table. "Come," she said, "I will show you the accounts." He followed her, once again, to a small room that had clearly been a butler's pantry. It was now her office. A large desk was covered in ledgers, maps of the estate, and stacks of paper held down by smooth river stones. A single, bright oil lamp cast a pool of light on the desk, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. It was the nerve center of her kingdom. She did not offer him a seat. She simply opened one of the ledgers. "You want to know how your annuity is being spent." For the next hour, she walked him through the finances of Blackwood Manor. She spoke of crop yields and livestock prices, of the cost of slate and the market value of wool. Her grasp of the details was absolute. She had not just salvaged the estate. She had transformed it into a viable, profitable enterprise. It was not making a fortune, not by a long shot, but was solvent. It was growing. He listened, his initial shock giving way to a grudging, and then a profound admiration. This was not the work of a desperate survivor. This was the work of a brilliant, ruthless strategist. She had taken the ruin he had given her and had built a fortress. "I sold the silver," she said, her tone matter-of-fact, as she pointed to a line item, "and the lead from the West Wing roof. It funded the initial repairs and the purchase of livestock." She looked up at him, her expression challenging him to object. He thought of the useless, tarnished silver, a symbol of the past he was trying to escape. He thought of the new cows, the warm bread, the vibrant garden. "A practical decision," he said, his voice quiet. A flicker of surprise in her eyes. She had expected a protest, an accusation of theft. She had not expected approval. She closed the ledger. "That is the state of the estate, Your Grace. It is small, it is precarious, but it is no longer a drain on your coffers. In fact," she added, a hint of pride in her voice, "we showed a small profit last quarter." "You have done a remarkable thing here, Alara," he said, using her name for the first time. It felt strange on his tongue. She did not react to the use of her name. She simply nodded, accepting the compliment as her due. "I did what was necessary." She began to tidy the papers on her desk, a clear signal that the meeting was over. He was being dismissed. Again. "Why?" he asked, the question breaking through his carefully controlled composure. "Why show me all this? You could have just let me wonder." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him, her gaze direct and unsparing. "Because this is not a game, Your Grace. This is my life. You may have abandoned this place, but you are still the Duke. You still hold the ultimate power here. I needed you to understand what you would be destroying if you decided to interfere." It was a warning, a clear, cold statement of the new reality. She had built this. She had earned it, and she would defend it, even from him. The first few days of Alistair's return settled into a strange, unspoken truce. He was the lord of the manor in name, but a ghost in practice. He took his meals with Alara and Finch, the silence between them thick with the weight of their shared history and divergent paths. During the day, he found himself adrift. The house ran on a rhythm he did not understand, a schedule of practical, necessary tasks in which he had no part. He would see Alara from a distance, her head bent in conference with Finch over a broken fence, or her hands deep in the soil of the conservatory. She was a whirlwind of focused energy, the still point around which this entire, humming enterprise turned. He, in contrast, was useless. He tried to assert some semblance of his old authority. He attempted to review the estate ledgers on his own, but found them impenetrable without her guidance. A complex system of annotations and cross-references that were clear to her, but gibberish to him. He walked the lands, but Finch had already planned the crop rotation for the next 5 years. He was a king without a portfolio, a commander without a command. The power vacuum he had left had been so completely filled by Alara that there was no space for him to re-enter. His presence was a disruption, a question mark in a world that had found all its answers without him. The staff, which now consisted of Mrs. Gable, Finch, 2 sturdy land girls from the village, and a boy who helped in the stables, treated him with a polite but distant correctness. They called him Your Grace, but they took their orders from the mistress. He was a figurehead, a portrait on the wall, while she was the government. The 4th night after his arrival, the weather turned. The sky, which had been a placid, watery gray, grew bruised and sullen. The wind began to moan around the corners of the house, a low, mournful sound that set Alastair's teeth on edge. By the time they sat down to dinner, a steady, hard rain was lashing against the windows of the small parlor. Finch seemed uneasy, his gaze repeatedly drifting toward the windows. "This is a bad one coming," he muttered. "Wind's in the wrong quarter. We'll lose some of the young apple trees if it gets up much more." Alara nodded, her brow furrowed. "Did you and Tom get them staked securely?" "As best we could, mistress. But it's a gale brewing, not a summer squall." As if on cue, a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the room, bleaching it of all color for a split second. It was followed, almost instantaneously, by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The force of it was physical, a blow to the chest. Alastair froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. The sound, it was not just loud. It was the sound of a cannonade, the sharp, splitting crack of a 12-pounder firing at close range. His heart hammered against his ribs. The air in his lungs turned to ice. He was no longer in a cozy parlor in the north of England. He was back on the field at Talavera, the air thick with smoke and the screams of dying men and horses. Another flash, another deafening roar. He flinched, a violent, involuntary jerk that sent his fork clattering to the floor. "Your Grace." Alara's voice seemed to come from a great distance. He could not answer. He was staring at the window, but he was not seeing the rain-streaked glass. He was seeing the muzzle flashes of the French artillery line, the rhythmic, murderous fire that had torn his regiment to pieces. His hands were gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He could smell it, the acrid scent of gunpowder, the coppery tang of blood. "Alastair." Alara's voice was sharper now, laced with concern. Another blast of thunder, closer this time, rattled the windows in their frames. Alastair let out a sharp, ragged gasp and pushed his chair back from the table, his breath coming in short, shallow pants. The walls of the room were closing in. He had to get out. He had to find cover. He stumbled to his feet, knocking his chair over with a crash. He did not seem to notice. His eyes were wide, unseeing, fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance, a point 3 years in the past. "Incoming," he rasped, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Take cover." Finch was on his feet, his face a mask of alarm. But it was Alara who moved. She did not panic. She did not rush to him. She simply stood up, her movements calm and deliberate, and placed herself between him and the door. "Alastair," she said, her voice low and steady, cutting through the fog of his terror. "Look at me." He did not seem to hear her. He was trying to get past her, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. "The line is breaking. We have to fall back." "There is no line," she said, her voice firm, authoritative. It was the voice she used with a spooked horse, calm, confident, and unwavering. "There is no battle. You are at Blackwood. You are in the parlor. It is raining." She put her hands on his shoulders. He was much larger than her, a mountain of a man, but he was trembling like a leaf. The physical contact seemed to break through some layer of his panic. He stopped trying to push past her and stared at her, his eyes wild and unfocused. "Alara," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm here," she said softly. "It's just a storm, Alistair. Just thunder." Another flash of lightning, another earth-shaking crash. He cried out a raw, wounded sound and squeezed his eyes shut, his whole body rigid with tension. He was lost again, back in the hell he had tried so hard to bury. She did not try to soothe him with platitudes. She did not tell him it was all right. It clearly was not. Instead, she acted. She took his hand. His skin was cold and clammy, but his grip was like iron. "Come with me," she said. It was not a request. It was a command. She led him, stumbling and disoriented, out of the parlor and away from the noise of the storm lashing against the front of the house. She did not take him to his room. She led him through the quiet corridors to the heart of her kingdom, the kitchens. The kitchen was the most fortified room in the house. Its walls were thick stone, its windows were small and high, and it was situated at the back of the house, buffered from the storm by the entire central block. The huge hearth was banked for the night, a bed of glowing embers casting a soft, steady red light into the room. The air was warm and smelled of yeast and dried herbs. It was a cave, a womb, a sanctuary. Section he allowed himself to be led to the large wooden table in the center of the room. She pushed him gently down onto a bench. He sat, hunched over, his head in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking. The Duke of Wrexham, the hero of the peninsula, the cold, ruthless politician, was utterly broken. Alara did not hover over him. She did not touch him again. She gave him space. But she did not leave him alone. She moved around the kitchen with a quiet, purposeful efficiency. She stirred the embers in the hearth and added a few small logs, which caught and began to burn with a soft, crackling sound. She filled a kettle from a pump in the corner and set it on a hook over the fire. She took a clay mug from a shelf and a small cloth-bound tin. She worked in silence, her movements a calm, grounding rhythm in the chaos of his mind. The storm still raged outside, but its fury was muted here, the thunder a distant, muffled rumble. The primary sounds were the crackle of the fire, the hiss of the kettle as it began to warm, and the soft clink of a spoon against the ceramic mug. Alistair slowly, gradually, began to return to himself. The scent of blood and gunpowder was replaced by the smell of wood smoke and the fragrant, calming aroma of the herbs Alara was spooning into the mug. He lifted his head from his hands and watched her, a small, determined figure in the soft firelight. She was not looking at him with pity. Her expression was one of intense, focused concentration. She was not treating him like a broken soldier or a madman. She was treating him like a problem to be solved, like a leaking roof or a set of unbalanced ledgers. It was the most profound act of respect he had been shown in years. When the tea was steeped, she brought the mug to the table and set it in front of him. It was a simple, earthenware mug, warm to the touch. The steam rising from it smelled of chamomile and mint. "Drink this," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it held the same unwavering authority. He picked up the mug. His hands were still trembling, but he managed to get it to his lips. The tea was hot, sweet, and intensely calming. He drank it down, the warmth spreading through his chest, chasing away the icy cold of his fear. He looked at her, really looked at her, across the table. Her face was pale in the firelight, her large gray eyes full of a quiet, weary understanding. She had seen him at his absolute worst, stripped of his title, his pride, his self-control. She had seen the raw, terrified man beneath the ducal armor. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice raspy. "How did you know what to do?" She sat down on the bench opposite him. She did not answer immediately. She simply looked at him, her gaze steady. "I've spent 3 years in this house," she said finally, her voice low. "I know what it is to be afraid. I know what it is to feel the walls closing in, to believe that you will not survive the night." She paused, her gaze dropping to the rough-hewn wood of the table. "And I know that when you are in the dark, platitudes are useless. What you need is a light, or a fire, or a cup of tea, something real, something solid to hold on to until the morning comes." He stared at her, a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to drown him, washing over him. It was not gratitude, not exactly. It was something deeper, something more elemental. It was recognition. He had sent her to this place to die, and in doing so, he had forged her into the one person in the world who could save him from himself. He looked down at the empty mug in his hands. It was solid. It was real. He was here, in a warm kitchen, with a woman who had faced her own demons and won. The storm still grumbled in the distance, but it was no longer a threat. It was just weather. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of his entire broken world. She simply nodded, her expression unchanged. "The storm will pass," she said. It was not a promise. It was a fact. And in the quiet, firelit kitchen of Blackwood Manor, for the first time in a very long time, he believed it. The dawn that followed the storm was pale and clean. The rain had washed the world, leaving the air crisp and smelling of wet earth and pine. Alistair woke in the green room, not from a nightmare, but from a deep, dreamless sleep, the first he had known in years. The memory of the previous night was sharp and humiliating, a raw wound in his pride. He had utterly lost control, broken down like a raw recruit in his first battle. And she had seen it all. He expected to face her at breakfast with a mixture of pity and contempt in her eyes. He expected a new power dynamic, one where she held his moment of weakness over him like a weapon. He braced himself for it as he walked into the small parlor. But the woman who sat at the head of the table, sipping her tea and reviewing a list with Finch, was the same woman from the day before. Cool, efficient, and completely focused on the business of the day. She looked up as he entered, her expression neutral. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said, her tone perfectly level. "I trust you slept well." There was no subtext, no hidden meaning. It was a simple, polite inquiry. It was as if last night had never happened. By refusing to acknowledge his vulnerability, she was giving him the gift of his dignity. It was a gesture of such profound, understated grace that it left him momentarily speechless. "I did," he finally managed to say, taking his seat. "Thank you." The conversation at the table was all practical. "The storm took down the old oak by the river," Finch reported. "It's blocking the path to the south pasture." "A shame," Ilera said, making a note on her list. "But the wood will be useful. We'll need it for the winter. Can you and Tom start sawing it up today?" "I'm mistress, but it's a big tree. It'll take us the better part of a week." "We have a week," she said simply. Alistair sat in silence, listening. A fallen tree was not a disaster. It was a resource. A problem was simply a task to be added to a list. This was how she saw the world. This was how she had survived. After breakfast, as Finch headed out to the river and Ilera prepared to go to her office, Alistair found himself, once again, without a purpose. He was about to retreat to the library, a cold, dusty room he had been using as a place to brood, when he stopped. He could not bear another day of useless inaction. "Wait," he said, his voice stopping Ilera in the doorway. She turned, one eyebrow slightly raised in inquiry. "The tree," he said, "the one Finch is clearing. I'm coming with you." It was not a request. It was a statement of intent. She studied him for a long moment, her gray eyes assessing. He was dressed, as usual, in the clothes of a gentleman. Fine linen shirt, well-cut trousers, polished boots. He looked utterly unsuited for manual labor. "You don't have an axe," she said, her tone dry. "Then I will find one," he retorted, "or I will use my hands. But I will not sit here and do nothing while this house is being put back together." A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps even approval, danced in her eyes. She had seen him broken. Now she was seeing him try to rebuild. "Finch keeps the tools in the old smokehouse behind the kitchen," she said. "He will likely try to talk you out of it. He is protective of his saws. I will manage Finch, he said, a hint of his old, ducal authority in his voice. He did manage Finch, though it was a near thing. The groundsman looked at him with profound skepticism when he appeared at the smokehouse, asking for an axe. "This is hard work, Your Grace," Finch said, his tone implying that Alistair had no concept of what hard work was. He was not wrong. "I am aware," Alistair said, picking up a heavy felling axe. It felt foreign, clumsy in his hands, which were more used to a pen or the reins of a thoroughbred. "Show me what needs to be done." The work was brutal. The fallen oak was a behemoth, its trunk as thick as a carriage. Finch and his son, Tom, a quiet, strapping lad of 16, were using a large two-man saw to cut the trunk into manageable sections. Alistair was tasked with limbing, chopping the smaller branches off the main trunk. It was back-breaking, mind-numbing labor. His hands, soft and uncalloused, were blistered within the first hour. His back, accustomed to chairs and saddles, screamed in protest. The muscles in his shoulders and arms, strong from fencing but unused to this type of repetitive strain, burned with a fire that was pure agony. He was clumsy, his swings often missing their mark. More than once, he had to stop, leaning on the axe, his lungs heaving, sweat stinging his eyes. Finch and Tom worked in a steady, efficient rhythm, never speaking, their bodies moving with the ingrained knowledge of the task. They did not mock him. They did not offer help. They simply worked, and by their silence, they invited him to do the same. He kept going. He was driven by a fierce, desperate need to prove something, not to them, but to himself. To prove that he was not just the broken man from the night before. To prove that he could be useful. To pay in some small, physical way for the sins of his past. Every swing of the axe was an act of penance. Every drop of sweat was a prayer. Alara appeared in the middle of the afternoon, carrying a basket. She did not comment on his disheveled appearance, the dirt smearing his face, the way his fine linen shirt was soaked with sweat and torn at the shoulder. She simply unpacked bread, cheese, and a jug of cool, fresh water. They stopped work and ate in silence, sitting on the trunk of the fallen tree. The food had never tasted so good. The water was a balm to his parched throat. For the first time, sitting there with Finch and Tom, sharing their simple meal, he did not feel like an intruder. He felt like part of the team. As they were eating, Alara walked over to a section of the trunk Alistair had been clearing. She ran her hand over a place where he had hacked away at a branch, leaving a jagged, ugly stump. "You're fighting it," she said, her voice quiet. She was not speaking to him, but to the wood. "You're trying to force it. An axe isn't about strength. It's about precision. Let the weight of the blade do the work. Find a grain. Work with it, not against it." She picked up a small hand axe from Finch's toolkit. She approached a smaller, uncleared branch. Her movements were not powerful, but they were fluid, economical. She did not swing from the shoulder, as he had been doing. She used her whole body, a graceful, turning motion that brought the axe down in a perfect, clean arc. The blade bit deep into the wood, exactly where she intended. Two more quick, precise chops, and the branch fell away, leaving a smooth, clean cut. She handed the axe to him. "Try again," she said. He stood up. He took the axe. He looked at the branch, at the grain of the wood, the way it grew from the trunk. He remembered her words. Work with it, not against it. He lifted the axe, not with brute force, but with a controlled, deliberate motion. He let the weight of the head guide his swing. The blade struck true, sinking into the wood with a satisfying thunk. It was a small thing, a single successful cut, but it felt like a monumental victory. He looked at her, and she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of approval. And in that moment, something shifted between them. The silence that had been a weapon, then a truce, was becoming something else. It was becoming comfortable. He went back to work, his movements more thoughtful, more efficient. The work was still hard, but it was no longer a battle. It was a partnership between him, the axe, and the tree. And as the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the woods, Alistair felt a sense of peace he had not known was possible. His body ached, his hands were raw, but his mind was quiet. For the first time in a very long time, he was not the Duke of Wrexham. He was just a man doing a day's hard, honest work. And it was enough. The days that followed fell into a new, unspoken routine. Alistair would rise at dawn, his body stiff and aching, and join Finch and Tom in their work. He learned to saw, to split logs, to mend fences. He learned the satisfaction of a well-set post, the quiet pride of a neatly stacked woodpile. His hands, once soft, became hard and calloused. The London pallor of his skin was replaced by a healthy, sun-in wind-brown hue. He was still the Duke, but the title felt more and more like a costume he had taken off and left in the closet. He and Alara rarely spoke of personal matters. Their conversations were about the practical realities of their world, the coming winter, the health of the livestock, the price of wool. They would spend hours in her small office, not as Duke and Ward, but as partners, their heads bent over the ledgers. He, with his knowledge of the wider world, of markets and politics, could offer a strategic perspective. She, with her intimate, hard-won knowledge of the estate, could provide the tactical details. He learned to respect her ruthless pragmatism. She, in turn, began to rely on his broader view. One evening, they were working late, trying to solve a discrepancy in the account from a neighboring market town. The room was quiet. The only sounds the scratching of her pen and the rustle of paper. The silence was easy now, a comfortable blanket they shared. He found the error, a simple transposition of numbers in a bill of lading. As he pointed it out, his hand brushed against hers. It was a fleeting, accidental contact, but it sent a jolt through him, a sudden awareness of her that was entirely separate from their work. Her skin was cool, her fingers stained with ink. He saw not the mistress of Blackwood, but the woman, Alara. He pulled his hand back as if burned. She did not look up from the ledger, but a faint flush of color rose in her cheeks. "So it is," she said, her voice perfectly steady. "Thank you. I have been looking for that for a week." The moment passed, but it left a ripple in the calm surface of their partnership. A new tension, one that was not about power or the past, but about the present, about the man and the woman, alone in a small, lamplit room, with the rest of the world shut out. The outside world, however, had not forgotten the Duke of Wrexham. It arrived, as it always did, on a lathered horse, in the form of a royal courier. The man's bright red coat was a jarring splash of color against the muted greens and grays of Blackwood. He carried a leather dispatch case, sealed with the royal crest. Alistair was in the stable yard, mucking out a stall, a task he now performed with a practiced, if unenthusiastic, efficiency when the courier arrived. The man's eyes widened in disbelief as he took in the sight of the Duke of Wrexham, shirtless, covered in sweat and straw, wielding a pitchfork. "Your Grace?" the courier asked, his voice uncertain. Alistair felt a hot flush of his old pride. He straightened up, suddenly aware of his state of undress, of the menial nature of his task. He was the Duke again, caught in a moment of unseemly reality. "I am he," Alistair said, his voice clipped. "What is it?" "An urgent dispatch from His Majesty. Your Grace." The courier dismounted and held out the case with a flourish. Alara appeared at that moment, drawn by the sound of the arriving horse. She took in the scene at a glance. The magnificent courier, the royal seal, the pitchfork in Alistair's hand. Her face, which had been slowly losing its guarded expression over the past weeks, instantly became a cool, unreadable mask. Her defensive walls went up so fast he could almost hear them click into place. She immediately assumed he would leave. Of course he would. He was the Duke. This was his world, the world of kings and couriers, of duty and power. Blackwood was just an interlude, a rustic retreat where he had played at being a simple man. The real world had called, and he would answer. "You will need to pack, Your Grace," she said, her voice brittle and formal. "I will have Mrs. Gable prepare your things." She turned to go, to retreat back in her fortress, to put the distance between them that had been so painfully bridged. "Wait," he said. He had not moved. He stood there, holding the pitchfork, the dispatch case still unopened in the courier's hand. He looked from the courier's expectant face to Alera's retreating back. He saw the two worlds, the two lives laid out before him. London, with its power games, its empty titles, its soul-crushing duty. And Blackwood, with its hard work, its honest aches, its quiet satisfactions. His past and his possible future. The choice, when it came, was surprisingly easy. "I'm not going," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying in the sudden silence of the stable yard. The courier stared at him, aghast. "But, Your Grace, it is a command from a king." "The king has thousands of loyal subjects," Alistair said, his gaze fixed on Alera. "He will have to make do with one less." He turned to the courier. "You will return to London. You will tell His Majesty's secretary that the Duke of Wrexham is indisposed, that he has found his duty elsewhere." But what do I do with this?" the courier asked, holding up the dispatch case as if it were a venomous snake. Alistair walked over to the man. He took the dispatch case. He did not open it. He walked to the small forge that Finch used for mending tools, where a low fire was still glowing. Without a word, he opened the door to the forge and tossed the leather case, with its royal seal and its urgent commands, into the flames. The leather smoked, curled, and then caught fire, the vellum inside blackening and turning to ash. It was an act of treason, an act of rebellion. It was an act of liberation. He turned back to Alera. She was staring at him, her eyes wide, her hand pressed to her mouth. The mask was gone. In its place was a look of stunned, breathtaking vulnerability. He walked toward her, closing the distance between them. He stopped in front of her, close enough to see the faint dusting of freckles on her nose, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin. "My duty is not in London anymore," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. "My duty is here." He reached out, not to touch her, but to gesture at the house, the gardens, the whole, thriving world she had built. With the leaky roof in the east wing, and the sick cow in the north pasture, and the accounts that never quite balance. He paused, and his voice dropped to a whisper. He looked directly into her eyes, laying his soul bare. "You are my home, Alera," he said. "This place, you are all the world I have left. You are all the world I want." And then, the last of her defenses crumbled. The mistress of Blackwood, the pragmatic survivor, the woman who had faced down death and despair and a hostile world without shedding a tear, began to cry. Not loud, racking sobs, but silent, streaming tears that ran down her cheeks, washing away the last of the dirt and the grime and the pain. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She simply took a step forward, into his arms, and leaned her head against his chest, burying her face in the rough, sweat-stained linen of his shirt. He dropped the pitchfork. It clattered, unnoticed, on the cobblestones. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, his calloused hands stroking her hair. He held her as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world, and at the same time, as if she were the anchor that was keeping him from being swept away. The courier, forgotten, stared for a moment at the scene. The Duke in his filth, the weeping mistress, the smoldering remains of a royal command. Then quietly, discreetly, mounted his horse and rode away, a story to tell that no one in London would ever believe. They stood there for a long time, in the middle of the stable yard, oblivious to the world. The sun began to set, painting the sky in the same bruised purple and faint rose that Alera had once watched alone. The coming winter was a certainty, a cold promise on the horizon. But for the first time, they would not face it alone. They would face it together, two broken pieces that had, against all odds, found a way to become whole. They were a permanent fixture now, holding each other against the fading light, in the heart of the home they had built, a house that was, like them, scarred and strong, and fiercely, completely alive.